Look under your stove right now, because if there's a black skillet sitting there, rusty at the edges, maybe a little warped, maybe the exact one your grandmother used every Sunday to fry chicken, you shouldn't put it back just yet, not before you hear what's coming. Last year, a pan that looked almost identical to the one you're picturing right now sold for $8,000 at auction. And it wasn't because it was rare looking or polished to a mirror shine. Because it wasn't. It looked like something you'd leave behind at an estate sale without a second glance. And that's precisely the point of everything that follows. Because in the next few minutes you're going to hear about 10 cast iron pans that look like garbage and turned out to be anything but, along with the small specific details that separate a $20 skillet sitting in a thrift store bin from a $2,000 piece sitting in a glass case at a specialty auction house. And stick with this all the way through, because the very last pan on this list was once priced at $8 just to get it off a shelf. And what happened to it afterwards still surprises people who have been collecting for decades. So before diving in, drop a comment and tell me what name, if any, is stamped on the bottom of the oldest pan sitting in your own kitchen right now, because you might already own something worth investigating. Let's be honest about the odds before going any further, because nobody should start digging through cabinets expecting to strike gold on the first try. And the truth is that the overwhelming majority of old cast iron pans out there, something like 95 to 98% of them, are worth a fairly modest $15 to $150. And that's simply the reality of a market flooded with decades of mass production. But that remaining sliver, that 2 to 5%, is a lot bigger and a lot more interesting than most people assume, mostly because so few people ever learn what to look for before they scrap a pan, donate it without a second thought, or worse, sandblast it down to bare metal and unknowingly grind away the very mark that made it valuable in the first place. To understand why any of this matters, it helps to know a little of the backstory, because cast iron cookware exploded across America in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, a period when foundries like Griswold, Wagner, and a whole scattering of smaller regional shops were competing fiercely on craftsmanship. And in that competitive scramble, some companies produced small batches, discontinued certain patterns almost as soon as they launched them, or stamped early logos for only a handful of years before switching to something new. And those narrow, easily overlooked windows of production are exactly where today's hidden value tends to hide, tucked into details most people walk right past. Take, for instance, the skillet stamped simply with the word eerie, which sits near the bottom of this list but is far from the least interesting, because most people assume any pan with faded, hard-to-read lettering is nothing more than old junk not worth a second look, when in fact some of the earliest Griswold pans were stamped with just that single word, eerie, the company's original name before it ever became Griswold. And those early Erie marked pieces frequently carry more value than the far more common later Griswold logo that replaced them. A fact proven in 2019 when a collector in Ohio picked up an Erie marked skillet at a barn sale for $4, and after flipping it over and gently cleaning the base, discovered a block-letter Erie logo paired with a small spider design underneath, a combination that told him instantly this was a pre-1900 piece. And 2 months later, he sold it to a specialty collector for $650. So if you're checking your own pans, flip them over and look specifically for the word Erie instead of Griswold. Pay attention to whether the font is raised and blocky rather than the smoother script used in later years. And take note of the pan number stamped near the handle, since smaller or oddly shaped numbers on early pieces can matter a great deal. And while an average Erie marked skillet in rough shape might only fetch $150 to $300, an exceptional example in a rare size and great condition has climbed well into the $600 to $800 range. From there, moving further up the list, there's the three-legged spider skillet, a pan that looks at first glance like nothing more than a campfire relic you'd expect to find at a flea market for pocket change. But three-legged spider skillets, especially the smaller sizes, are among the most sought-after pieces in the entire hobby, precisely because they were only manufactured for a limited stretch of time before flat-bottomed stoves made the legs completely unnecessary. And this played out almost unbelievably at an estate sale in rural Georgia in 2021, when a small number 3 spider skillet sat quietly inside a box labeled free, right outside the garage, until a regular at these kinds of sales recognized the distinctive leg shape and the telltale size number, and handed over $2 for the entire box just to claim that one pan, which later sold at a specialty auction for $1,200. So when you're checking your own cookware, count the legs, because 3 short legs is the giveaway. Check the size number stamped on the handle, since smaller numbers like number 3 tend to be rarer than the larger, more common sizes, and inspect the surface closely for any maker's mark that might still be visible even faintly beneath layers of rust, keeping in mind that while common spider skillets in fair shape typically run $200 to $400, a rare small size in solid structural condition has reached well over $1,000. Next comes a pan that trips people up precisely because of how familiar the brand name sounds, the Wagner Sydney-0 skillet, because most people hear the name Wagner and immediately assume it's common, And to be fair, most Wagner pans genuinely are, since the company produced cookware for decades and flooded the market with it. But a small subset marked Sydney-0, referencing the Ohio town where Wagner was based, paired with a small 0 symbol. Represents an early transitional stamp that serious collectors specifically hunt for, something that became very real for a family in Indiana in 2020 after they inherited a full set of cookware and nearly donated all of it without a second thought, until a friend who collected cast iron glanced at one particular skillet, spotted the Sydney-0 stamp, and asked to buy it directly on the spot, later selling it to a Wagner specialist for $900. So if you're inspecting your own pans, look specifically for the word Sydney-0 rather than the more generic Wagnerware. Check whether the logo sits centered and slightly raised instead of flat printed into the metal. And compare the shape of the handle, since early Wagner handles tend to run shorter and noticeably thicker than later versions. And while standard Wagnerware pans typically sell for $30 to $80, a confirmed Sydney-0 piece in solid shape has sold in the $500 to $900 range. Then there's a category that sounds almost like a trick, the unmarked ghost skillet, a pan with no stamp, no brand name, no obvious story to tell, which leads most people to assume it has zero collector value whatsoever. But some unmarked pans are actually early hand-finished pieces from small regional foundries that simply never stamped their work at all, and specific casting and grinding techniques can still identify them to a trained eye. Which is exactly what happened at a Tennessee flea market in 2022, when a dealer very nearly passed on a completely blank bottom skillet sitting on a folding table, only for another vendor nearby to notice the unusually fine hand-ground finish on the cooking surface, buy it for $10, and later resell it to a niche collector for $475 based purely on its casting characteristics. So run your fingers across the inside surface of any old pan you find, because an unusually smooth hand-finished feel is a strong signal worth paying attention to. Look for heat rings, meaning raised concentric circles on the bottom, and weigh the pan in your hand, since some early unmarked pieces are noticeably heavier than modern reproductions, and while most unmarked pans sell for only $10 to $40. The rare correctly identified early foundry piece can bring $300 to $500. Moving further up, there's the Griswold slant logo skillet, and this one trips people up in the opposite direction, because once people learn that the name Griswold carries real value, they start assuming any Griswold pan is automatically worth hundreds of dollars, which simply isn't true since most Griswold pans are actually quite common. But the earliest slant logo, used only briefly before the company standardized its block lettering, represents a genuine rarity. And this connects right back to that same Ohio collector from the Erie skillet story, because a year after that original find, he came across a slant logo Griswold piece at a completely different sale for $6, and that specific early logo variant, combined with an unusual pan size, ended up selling at auction for $1,400, so look closely at the lettering angle on any Griswold pan you find. Because a noticeable slant instead of straight block letters is the key detail to catch, check the size number, since unusual or transitional sizes paired with this logo significantly increase value, and pay attention to the overall casting quality, since early pieces tend to show finer detail work throughout. And while common Griswold pans generally run $40 to $150, a confirmed slant logo piece has sold for well over $1,000. Halfway through this list comes something a little different, a Dutch oven lid entirely on its own, separated from whatever pot it once belonged to, and most people assume a lone lid without its matching base is essentially useless, but certain early self-basting Dutch oven lids featuring a distinctive dimpled underside are collected on their own merits, sometimes even more aggressively than the pot they originally came with. Simply because complete match sets are so rare that collectors missing exactly one piece will pay handsomely to complete their set, which is exactly what happened to a picker in South Carolina back in 2018, who found a single dimpled lid at a yard sale, no pot anywhere in sight, for $3, only to discover it matched a specific rare pattern number, leading a collector who happened to be missing that exact lid to pay $380 for it alone. So flip any lid you find and look for small raised dimples on the underside. Since that indicates a self-basting design, check for a pattern number stamped near the top handle area, and note the handle shape itself, since a loop versus a straight bar can point to a different era entirely. And while a plain common lid might sell for only $15 to $30, a rare correctly matched self-basting lid is sold for $300 to $400 entirely on its own. Then there's a category most people overlook completely without a second thought, the miniature toy skillet, a pan so small it looks like nothing more than a child's plaything or a decorative novelty, leading most people to assume it's worth next to nothing. But some of these miniature skillets were actually salesman samples, used by traveling salesmen decades ago to demonstrate foundry quality without hauling around a full set of heavy, full-size pans, and these genuine samples are remarkably rare. Something an antique shop in Missouri learned in 2020 when a tiny 3-inch skillet sat priced at $5 inside a bin of children's toys, until a collector recognized the proportions and the finish as belonging to a salesman's sample rather than an ordinary toy, bought it on the spot, and later sold it to a specialty miniatures collector for $650, so measure any tiny pan you come across. Since true salesman samples are typically fully functional miniatures rather than flimsy toy replicas, check carefully for a maker's mark even if it's tiny, and feel the weight in your hand, because genuine cast iron samples are noticeably heavier than any toy alternative. And while ordinary novelty miniatures sell for only $10 to $25, confirmed salesman samples have sold for $400 to $700. Near the top of the list sits a category defined almost entirely by unfamiliarity, the unrecognized regional skillet, meaning any pan stamped with a brand name nobody seems to recognize, which usually gets dismissed instantly as a cheap, no-name knockoff not worth researching. But small regional foundries that only operated for a handful of years, before closing down or merging into larger companies, left behind low production pans that are genuinely scarce today simply because so few of them were ever made in the first place. A lesson learned by a picker in rural Kentucky in 2021, who found a skillet stamped with an unfamiliar regional brand inside an auction box lot, paid essentially nothing for the entire box, and later discovered through a collector forum that the foundry behind it had only operated for about 4 years, a discovery that eventually led to that same skillet selling for $525. So search any unfamiliar name stamped into the bottom of a pan you find. Because obscure absolutely does not mean worthless, check the condition of the cooking surface closely, since scarcity combined with good condition multiplies value quickly, and don't hesitate to ask in collector communities before assuming an unfamiliar name means nothing, keeping in mind that unrecognized regional brands often sell for only $20 to $60 out of pure ignorance, while properly identified rare examples have sold for $400 to $550. Second from the very top is a pan most sellers would never think twice about, the cracked but rare skillet, because a visible crack running across the base usually signals to most people that a pan is ruined and worthless, leading sellers to toss these pieces immediately without a second thought. But for extremely rare patterns, even a cracked or otherwise damaged example can still hold significant value to collectors who want it purely for display purposes or for documenting a specific pattern, rather than for actual cooking, which is exactly what happened to a collector in Pennsylvania who found a rare pattern skillet with a hairline crack running across its base at a barn sale, a pan most buyers would have walked straight past, but because that particular pattern was so scarce, a serious collector bought it anyway for $700, purely for its rarity and its historical documentation value, so never discard a damaged pan automatically. And instead check the pattern and maker's mark first, photograph and research any unusual shapes or sizes before assuming that damage alone kills the value entirely. And understand that while cracked pieces will always sell for less than perfect ones, less can still mean hundreds of dollars for the right pattern, since a damaged common pan might be worth only $5 to $10 in pure scrap value, while a damaged but genuinely rare pattern piece has still sold for $500 to $700. And that finally brings this back around to where it started, that pan mentioned at the very beginning, the one that was almost sold for scrap metal entirely. Because 15 years ago this particular pan, slightly warped, rusted nearly solid, with no visible markings anyone could make out at the time, seemed destined for nothing more than the scrap bin, and it sat priced at just $8 simply to move it off the shelf and out of the way, until a regular customer stopped the sale, turned the pan over, and pointed out very faint casting marks that had been completely missed underneath all that rust, marks that ultimately matched a documented early transitional piece produced between two well-known foundries, a pan made for less than 2 years before a design change eliminated it entirely. And that $8 price tag stayed on the pan for almost a full year afterward, until slow, careful, patient cleaning finally revealed the full mark underneath. At which point it sold privately to a collector out of state for $2,400, making it one of the biggest near misses in the entire world of cast iron collecting, and exactly why every single pan deserves a genuine second look, no matter how far gone it appears before it ever gets priced simply to move, because you should never fully judge a pan by rust alone, since gentle, patient cleaning can reveal marks you'd otherwise miss entirely. You should always research any faint or partial marking before pricing something to sell quickly, and when real doubt creeps in, it's always worth asking someone with more specific collecting experience before letting a piece go for good. And while most rusty, unmarked-looking pans really are worth only $10 to $30, that one specific example, once cleaned, properly identified, and sold to exactly the right buyer, went for $2,400. Which is exactly why the rule holds true from the very first pan on this list to the very last one: clean before you scrap it, and check carefully before you assume anything. Because none of these numbers are guarantees, they're real examples sold once to specific buyers under very specific circumstances, and your own pan sitting under your stove right now might well be common. And honestly, statistically speaking, it probably is. But now you know exactly what to actually look for before you toss it out, sell it off for scrap price, or sandblast away a mark that might have mattered more than you ever realized. So if you checked your own kitchen while reading through all of this, drop a comment and share exactly what you found stamped on the bottom.